very lucky to meet Jorge Caballero again. And he did a fantastic concert last night, doing unbelievable things in his usual manner. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, shall we just start with talking about technique, what your attitude to...
Well, sure. But you know, there's a funny thing, because I don't know if this tendency still exists, but there's always between guitarists and all musicians in general the idea of like technique as something that we need to idolize, or technique as something that we need to really demonize in a sense. You know, there are ones that think technique is very important. They all focus on technique and technical exercises, and then there are ones that think, well, you know, if you're too focused on technique, you know, what's important is the music, and you know, so and if you have good technique, you are blamed for lack of musicality, you know, inherently, you know, and then if you are more musical, you lack technique, you're also accused of not having technique. You know,
this just happens a lot.
And and I think that technique is kind of like physics. It's like the laws of gravity. You know, you can't argue with the fact that the Earth is pulling objects to itself.
Yes.
And you could say, well, there's too much talk about physics. You know, what's important is the apple falling from the tree. Well, and what technique is basically the physics of what we do. They describe why is it that the things that we do can happen,
yes,
and why they don't happen. So it is just an entity that allows us to better understand how our fingers can do something with the guitar. And the better we can understand that, the more we can manipulate the fabric of his principles.
Yes.
You know, and so it's quite useful. But of course, it never takes away from the notion of what it is. It's simply explaining the natural processes by which we play. And our degree of musicality is regulated by, well, our musical intelligence, basically. And so, you know, technique is not something to be, you know, idolized or demonized. It's just simply something that the more we can understand of, then the better we play.
So would you consider that you have analyzed technique to a great extent to bring it to the level at which you use it?
I think so, and you know, a lot of it, and I think because in our territory, you know, I think for all instruments, is quite new in terms of like understanding technique as an issue of, like, say, biomechanics. You know, it's not developed to the degree as it has in sports. You know, and so it's a very new territory. So a lot of this thought and exploration has been trial and error, just based on experience.
Yes.
You know, things that, you know, made sense in a logical sense in the brain, but then when applied to a real situation, they didn't work. And so you start thinking, well, why do these things work, and why do these things not work? You know, so yeah, it's, you know, but that's a result of me being a guitarist and having the experience of thinking about how to solve a problem with a piece, and then having to test it against the difficult ground of playing a concert. You know, so yeah.
But for instance, some of the things you did in your transcription of the Mozart, you have to have quite an advanced way of thinking to even think it was possible to do.
Perhaps, yes.
At which level? I mean, how did you reach this level? You sit down every day and you I don't know, do scales, or you think I want this effect, or
you know,
how do I do it?
It's actually quite rare that I will practice scales. But I mean, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't practice scales, but you know, I find this actually when people ask me, should I practice scales, I ask them to sing a scale.
Yes.
If they can sing a scale, then they should be practicing scales.
Okay.
You know, because they don't understand the pitch relations in a tonal system, and so if you're not going to be able to sing that,
yes,
then at least you should be able to learn it by recording it through your ear by playing. You know, so I think the primary function of the scale is to help us understand the musical
yes,
relations,
yes,
of sound and fingers. You know, but I don't practice scales very much. You know, but it's and piece like Mozart. I mean, it might seem that technique is different or more, or something completely new, or a complete preconception of what technique and what the guitar can do. But actually, the way I look at it is basically is based on the same principles of what we already know, just brought to a more profound level, perhaps. So the opening of that Mozart is a basic chord, and so basic chord execution, no problem. Then and then we have a running two beats of running 16th notes accompanied by a bass, right? All of that is kind of basic procedures, basic procedures that Giuliani will have in his writing, that Sor has in his writing. And so if we really truly learn the value of how when Sor writes his etudes and how he creates textures, and if you really study them and you make them work in a musical sense, and that provides a great tool for you. And so when you're looking at something like Mozart, it becomes basically the same idea. I'm going to give you a specific example. After the first four measures of the Mozart comes the first state note, and that passage has a kind of a modified Alberto bass, and of course that would be a complicated issue, because now you have to slur and you have to play the other notes and separate, and so you think, wow, that's quite unique, but it's not. We have a similar texture on the first Rossignano by Giuliani.
That's right.
Yeah, and when it's in D major, the difficulty, the devil of that moment is to be able to articulate that melody beautifully and have to accompany your Alberto bass with thumb only. And so it provides a very difficult situation. If you study that piece, and you can establish a connection between one thing and the other. The only essential difference is that between that and the Mozart that I did is the speed at which it's happening.
Well, exactly. So how do you practice that? Do you just sit down, or do you think it through and then you can play it, or do you sit down for hours working out what your thumb is doing?
I think about those things kind of as programming information in your brain. Many years ago, I read an article. It was in '97 actually, and I was on my way to a concert. I was at an airport, and I had some time in the layover, and so I went to a bookstore at the airport, and they had Time magazine article there, one of the magazines, about the brain and speech, and they have been conducting studies with people who stutter, and they explained in the article, they explained how exactly it is that we speak, and what happens is, they said, more or less is, I'm paraphrasing, but they said that the coordination of all the muscles required to create one sound when we speak is so complex. It takes the coordination of about 27 separate muscles. So it would be, if the brain had to consciously, physically coordinate all of these functions and make them execute. Well, not quite that. What it says that the rate at which we would be able to pronounce things would be about one sound per second, or something. Literally. So of course we don't speak that slowly. And so how is it that it's possible for us to do this? Well, what happens is that the brain, when observing and analyzing sounds, and the coordination of all the muscles required to execute it, what it does in order to save effort is it locks all of the coordinated movements into a single code sequence. And when called upon, the sequence is released, not the coordination. The sequence carries the coordination. And they conducted a study with people who stutter. So what happens is that when we're learning something, when the brain's learning something, there's the issue of listening, relaying, observing information, creating a pattern that works, then releasing the pattern, and then evaluating the pattern.
Yes.
And so what happens with people who stutter, or the theory was that the evaluation mechanism was triggered too early in the in the process. So before the brain could release the system, it was also blocking it from coming out. You know, so the experiment involved that they, you know, the people who stutter, that they read something out loud, and then they gave them headphones that basically had white noise.
Yes.
You know, so they would not be able to hear themselves. And what happened is in 99.5% of cases they no longer stuttered, because the listening mechanism that was impeding them from speaking was no longer there. It was cancelled out. So it was a great discovery. But that actually led me to think a lot about the nature of how we the nature of how is it that we know things on the guitar technique. You know, I was thinking about, you know, we really can't be consciously aware of every single movement that we create. You know, so we that means that everything that we do is processed and transmitted into a single idea. And if it isn't, then our technique is deficient. What's going to happen is the same thing that happens to stutterers. And you know, you can relate this idea to fingers. If we are playing something, say, that we want at a certain tempo, and we are playing under tempo, then we can feel very solid doing it. But if we suddenly try to increase the tempo, then the first thing that's going to happen is that we feel that our brains are working at a higher rate. And at some point, what happens is the brain can no longer keep up with us. And so something stops. Now, if we, on top of that, we try to push through that, so then the brain's going to have to find a different mechanism to operate.
Right.
And at that point is when technical problems start to appear, fundamental technical problems. So this was what I started to think about at that point. I mean, I think I was 20 or 21 when I read this. You know, so I was completely fascinated by this idea.
Yeah.
And I never followed on what happened to the study. You know, I don't know exactly, you know, what was discovered or what, you know, after all, it was a theory, but it really led me to think about how is it that we know what we know with our hands.
Yes.
And so I conducted some experiments on my own, basically. And I said, okay, so if I have a sequence that requires me to think of this action, then this action, and then this action over here, all of these are basically codes that are then released in one single moment. Now, for someone who's unfamiliar with this concept, you know, players out there, the way it works for any one of us is, you know, I'm sure that you've ever had a lesson. You go to your lesson and the teacher tells you to start from a specific spot, and you can't. You need a running start. Now, the reason for the running start is because that is the moment in which your brain has locked a pattern that can then release.
Yes.
You know, so if you're asked to start somewhere in the middle of that pattern, then you don't have a point of reference. Your brain does not know that spot. You know, it doesn't know it as an independent idea. It's already locked as a coordinated function to other parts. So this is kind of what I'm talking about. So if you have that experience, you can understand more or less what I'm describing. You know, and you know, so if you say, okay, so if an action goes from here to here, and then another action goes from here to here, all of that can actually become one single pattern as well.
Yeah.
You know, and the better I know a pattern, the better I know a sequence, then the more quickly it can operate. Basically, it's the idea of turning 1 to 3 into 123.
Yes.
You know, so.
So what's the process you go through? Is that what the practice is?
There are two facets. Yeah, first of all, you have to understand what your sequences are going to be, and then you have to be able to see them in kind of in a summarized version of itself. You know, where pretty much like any information that we know, if you have to give a speech or read a paragraph from memory,
yes,
you're not consciously thinking of all of the paragraph. You know, you're thinking of certain aspects of it. You know, and I also did this experiment with a student one time where I just asked her to memorize a paragraph, you know, and to explain how memorization works, you know,
yes.
because she was a great reader, and you know her musical abilities were kind of suffering a bit because she couldn't listen to herself well, and so I had to explain to her how memory works and the specificity of memory, and so the paragraph started with, this is from the fourth book of Caballero, you know, the exercises.
Yes.
It'd be the preface says the culmination of a task, the attainment of a desired goal is not often the result of a succession of successful steps, but often arises from a series of partial failures. You know, and so, you know, just the way that she had to learn this. Then what happened is that she kind of learned it slowly, and then I said, okay, now you have to say it. And at first, nothing was coming out, and I said the combination, and then the moment I said the combination, then a lot of the sequence starts to come out.
Yeah.
You know, so there are ways in which you're recording information. So going back to guitar drums,
Yes.
you know, you have similar idea. You have specific triggers that you know about, patterns of movement that you create, and then eventually they become just kind of a general idea that then has to be released. Yeah, so
I sort of understand that when we do everyday actions, like pour a pot of tea into a cup.
right.
You don't think about every single thing you have to do. That is actually something you know you can do, and we don't practice that actually. We just have it's a combination of different things that we know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, suppose, and I like to do this for fun, you know, to entertain myself in the morning, for example. You know, you pour a cup of coffee and then you're actually doing something else.
Yeah. Yes.
And you know, I like to do these things because I think they have to be possible. The brain knows how to do this. You also know how to do this.
Yeah.
You know, like bring another thing, bring a plate over. You know. So, but it's not quite the same. Your brain knows how to do this with the condition that all of the other parts remain in place.
Yes.
You know. But if you have this object over here, it also knows how to do that, but it doesn't know how to do this plus that. Let's suppose this is entity 1 and this is entity 2. So now you have to figure out how 1 and 2 relate to each other. And then after you understand how they relate to each other, you know, that's going to require higher brain function, coordinating the two things. Then if you keep doing this, then your brain is going to understand how the two objects work together, and your brain will lock that into a single sequence. And so when someone asks you to do it, you will know exactly the measurement proportions. You know, and that's more or less what I'm talking about. You know, this how technique operates. Of course, with fingers, it is a lot more complicated because things are so much more minute.